And now, the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, October the 2nd. My name is Pam, and let's get started. This is my home. Black Appalachians find voice in protests. Pervasive stereotypes of Appalachia ignore the presence of Black people in the region, but now Black Appalachians are finding an opportunity in the nationwide racial justice protests to share their history. By Piper Hudspeth Blackburn. In Louisville, Kentucky, Deja Hogg has known racism her entire life, but until recently, she thought she and her family had to face it on their own. Miss Hogg, 19, lives in Whitesburg, Kentucky, a town of 2,000 people in the heart of Appalachia. She is biracial, born to a Black father and a white mother, and can recall times when she and her brothers were targets of racial slurs, suspicious glances, and rude comments. But in the wake of this year's nationwide protests against institutional racism, sparked by George Floyd's killing in Minnesota, Black Appalachians have found an opportunity for their history and struggles to be recognized more widely. Though the national reckoning on racism has raised awareness about the issue for many white Americans, that it is also echoing in the hills of Appalachia is particularly striking in a region that isn't known for its diversity. Ms. Hogg saw how the message of protests, which were also fueled by the police killing of Breonna Taylor in Kentucky, was resonating when she organized a rally in her home county of Lecter, where 2% of the population of about 20,000 is Black. She thought only a few would show up, but roughly 200 did, most of them white. "This is my home," Miss Hogg said. "All my friends and all these young people, they're ready to fight." The experience helped transform Miss Hogg's own idea of her community in eastern Kentucky. Though the majority of Black Kentuckians live in the metropolitan areas of Louisville and Lexington, many have resided in the mountains in the east for generations. However, pervasive stereotypes of Appalachia, that its residents are predominantly white, poor, ignorant about race relations at best, and at worst racist, ignore the presence of Black people in the region and the history of multiracial coalitions that marched for racial justice and workers right there, notes University of Tennessee at Knoxville sociologist Nkechi Elamin. "Invisibility is a major part of the experience of Black folks in Appalachia," said Miss Elamin, who also co-hosts the Black in Appalachia podcast. "You don't think of a movement like Black Lives Matters of being something that is vibrant in a region like this, right? Because you don't think of Black people when you think of this region. But many are working to increase the visibility of Black people in the region, and the demographics are changing as well. Racial minorities made up nearly half of Appalachia's population growth in the past 2 decades. This year, a Black lawmaker from Louisville nearly pulled off an upset in the Democratic primary for U.S. Senate with a campaign built around the slogan, 'From the Hood to the Holler.' State Rep Charles Booker bet his campaign on the idea that concern about injustices done to Black Americans by police mattered to people everywhere, and he nearly defeated a heavily bankrolled opponent. Micaiah Davis grew up not far from the Kentucky border in Big Stone Gap, Virginia, and he has also been trying to change perceptions about Appalachia and the Black community's place in it. At the STAY Project, a multiracial youth coalition, he organizes programs for young Black Appalachians that educate them about their history and encourage more community involvement. Mr. Davis is long felt being Black made him an outsider in Appalachia, and that he had no choice but to leave. If economic prospects were already bleak, racism seemed to exacerbate those challenges. But working with STAY has given him hope about his future in his hometown. "It made me realize that I don't have to make this exodus from the region to be successful, to thrive," he said. "I never would have thought about identifying as Appalachian before that." This summer's protests have him feeling optimistic about the work he's been doing, trying to alleviate the impact of racism on Black people and confronting the prejudices he sees in everyday interactions. The protests also made him feel more connected to the larger Black experience in the U.S., despite the different challenges faced by urban and rural communities. If you're Black in America, you're Black in America. he said. It may not be overt police brutality caught on camera. Sometimes it's a lot more covert, a lot more malicious. In Kentucky, Mr. Booker is trying to show people of different racial backgrounds that they're connected too. His Senate campaign particularly focused on economic inequalities in a state rife with poverty. Out of the 80 Appalachian counties designated as distressed by the Appalachian Regional Commission in 2019, nearly half are located in Kentucky. Since his loss, he founded an organization called Hood to Holler to continue discussing this issue, as well as democratic participation and climate change. While some Appalachians, like Americans elsewhere, have rejected the ongoing protests as a threat to their way of life, and interest has waned for others, Miss Hogg is still hopeful for the future. And though she's disappointed that no officers were charged in the killing of Miss Taylor, she doesn't see it as a reason to give up. Some close friends and family haven't been as supportive as predicted, but she's inspired by the encouragement she received, especially from Whitesburg artists who have used their work to spread awareness. Don't get me wrong, there are people that need to change, Ms. Hogg said. I'm hopeful that will change a few more hearts. And now, a Thai village takes a novel approach to save ancestral forest. A wetland forest in northern Thailand helped protect the villagers of Ban Bueng Ruang from flooding. Faced with the threat of development, they launched a social media campaign to save their ancestral forest. By Rena Chandra Thomas Reuters Foundation, Bueng Ruang, Thailand. The villagers of Ban Bueng Ruang in northern Thailand has long known that they benefited from the community wetland forest that supplied them with fish and firewood, but it wasn't until devastating floods in 2010 that they realized just how much. That year, flooding from the Ing River, which often spills its banks in the annual rainy season, was particularly severe, inundating several villages. Ban Bueng Ruang escaped the worst of it because the 583-acre wetland forest served as a buffer. If it weren't for the wetland, our village would have also got flooded severely, said Srong Pol Chanthar Ruang, chairman of the Bueng Ruang Wetland Forest Conservation Group, known as the BRWFCG. We realized then how important it was for us. That made us more aware of the threats to the wetlands and more determined to protect it. He told the Thomas Reuter Foundation as he walked around the forest, pointing to edible mushrooms and honeycombs. Destruction of natural resources, the denial of forest rights, and loss of community lands in Thailand for industry and tourism have hurt farmers and villagers, many of whom lack formal tenure. When the Thai government in 2015 earmarks Chai Kong district, where Ban Bueng Ruang is located, as part of a special economic zone, or an SEZ, the villagers decided to oppose the plan to infill the wetland with a novel approach. They set up the BRWFCG, mobilized support from other conservation groups and academics in the local university, and appealed to the National Human Rights Commission of Thailand, or the NHRCT, saying their lives and livelihoods were at stake. It worked in 2018. Authorities withdrew the proposal, and on Tuesday, the BRWFCG will receive the United Nations Equator Prize for outstanding community efforts to reduce poverty through the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. Convincing the government to conserve the wetland forest was a monumental achievement made through advocacy and dialogue, said David Gantz, executive director of the Center for People and Forests, which is RECOFTC, a Bangkok-based organization which backed the community. Bueng Ruang is a successful model for community forestry and showcases a nature-based solution to environmental injustice. The community achievement is an inspiration to others who may be facing similar challenges, he added. There was the community's right to participate. Wetlands, such as floodplains, marshes, mangroves, and peatlands, help purify water, replenish groundwater, limit flooding, and store carbon, researchers say. Along coastlines, they provide a buffer against storms and surges. Yet across Asia, demand for land for housing and farming has led to wetlands being destroyed, even as more intense rainfall and rising seas cause more frequent river and coastal flooding. Thailand has 15 sites defined under the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, totaling 15,645 square miles. But authorities often fail to recognize their importance and the community's role in preserving them, says Niwat Roykawa, head of the Chang Kong Conservation Group. Activism and knowledge are key to conserving natural resources. We have to educate the community that they have a constitutional right to participate in natural resource management, said Mr. Rokawa, who backed the Boon Rawang campaign. Government officials in the area are listening to us more because they recognize the role of the community, said Mr. Roakawa, whose 2-decade-old community organization has fought against deforestation, dams, and unchecked development in northern Thailand. BRWFCG launched advocacy and social media campaigns to showcase their community forestry management model and submitted academic research to show how vital the wetlands was to the local ecosystem and for mitigating disasters. With nearly 300 species of flora and fauna and dozens of edible and medicinal plants, the forest is vital to the food security of the villagers. It also has the potential to store 26 tons of carbon per 0.16 hectare, the research showed. At a ceremony to celebrate the Equator Prize earlier this month, Chiang Rai Province Acting Governor Kripek Pachara Baranan also acknowledged the community's effort. This forest has a history of hundreds of years. I am very pleased that the Boon Rawang community has preserved and taken care of the forest, he said, adding that he endorsed their proposal to declare the wetland as a Ramsar site. Preserving a community kitchen for future generations. Thailand aims to increase its forest cover to about 40% of total land area, from just over a third now. But land rights activists have voiced concerns that the government's policy have hurt communities who live in or near forests. At the same time, forests face constant threats from industrial projects. Before the SEZ, Ban Boon Rawang had defeated proposals for factories and plantations. We inherited this forest from our ancestors, and it is our duty to preserve it for future generations, said Niam Chantha Rawang, head of the village women's group. The SEZ is canceled, but there is no guarantee something else won't come up. That's why we want it to be declared a Ramsar site, she said. Forest authorities will work with local communities to resolve any conflicts, says Minister of National Resources and Environment, Warawat Silpa Arka. We have to find ways to enable people to coexist with forests, he said. The Boon Rawang community of nearly 300 families manages the forest through traditional methods, such as tree ordination ceremonies, and also has its own clear rules. The rules include not cutting trees beyond a certain size, a ban on hunting, and the commercial sale of bamboo and firewood. Villagers can fish and collect crickets, mushrooms, and firewood. The Boon Rawang wetland provides direct and indirect ecological services worth about $4 million annually. RECOFTC estimates, which includes food and other products, as well as the value from water retention, the wildlife, and heritage. It not only provides food and livelihoods, it enables the community to preserve its identity and culture, said Tenjai Dites, a former NHRCT commissioner who studied the case. But even the community's best efforts cannot stop the impact of climate change and upstream dams that are hurting the flow of the River Ing that sustains the wetlands, said Mr. Srongpol. This time of year, we normally have to move around the forest by boat, but for the past couple of years, the river is low, he said. If there is no flooding, there is fewer fish, and the vegetation will begin to die. The forest is like our kitchen. If it is destroyed, how will we eat? Up next, Behind the Masks, Teachers and Students Struggle to Communicate, by Colette Davidson. In Paris, the clear plastic face mask that Valerie Jarossin wears cuts into her chin a little, but at least it doesn't fog up her glasses like the cotton masks. The elementary school teacher considers herself fortunate. She has the space to stand at a distance from her students while ensuring that they can still read her lips. It's not le voiture, it's la voiture, said Mrs. Jurasin, gesticulating animately and exaggerating pronunciations to the fourth grader in a hot pink t-shirt and tightly pulled bun standing at the blackboard. Ms. Jurasin teaches at CELEM, a public school in Paris for children who are deaf or hard of hearing. Some of the students wear hearing aids, others have cochlear implants, but all of them rely on reading lips to communicate. Around 385,000 students with disabilities headed back to school in France this month. No one is learning remotely unless a COVID-19 outbreak forces a change. Children 11 and under are not required to wear masks, but universal mask wearing for adults in France due to the pandemic has meant major challenges for teachers like Ms. Jurasin, as well as those teaching the very young or French as a foreign language. Their students all learn through lip reading, facial expression, and imitation. There have been calls in France to make transparent masks free for teachers, and 100,000 are on their way thanks to a government order. But that still won't supply every teacher who has students with disabilities. And where the expectation is for the government to provide all materials necessary for teachers to do their job, bearing the cost of a constant supply can feel burdensome. The pandemic is forcing teachers of all types of students to rethink how they transmit language and the emotion necessary to make meaningful connections, and to create tactics for optimal learning in less than ideal situations. When children are learning to speak and read, they imitate letters by the sound the mouth makes, says Cecil Vineau, a Paris-based child psychologist. Being able to see the motions of the mouth is a learning tool, not just a vector of emotion. Plexiglass for closed quarters. Stacked at the back of Miss Jurasin's classroom are the plexiglass barriers she places between herself and a student if she has to be in close proximity for a lesson. The 7 odd speech therapists on site at CELEM also use them during individual sessions to help students process verbal language and improve pronunciation, volume, and pitch. This tool, along with a stronger reliance on visual supplements to lip reading, like printed pictures, have become critical in the age of wearing masks, especially for school's youngest students who at age 3 may not understand sign language yet. And when nothing else works, says Ms. Jurasin, teachers are obliged to fudge the rules for a moment. Sometimes I just have to pull my mask down and mouth it to them. That's been the case for Elodie Rieu when her little students aren't pulling her mask down for her. Ms. Rieu works at La Villa des Enfants daycare in the east of the city with infants and children under 3. Ms. Rieu says she often has to pull down her mask for a moment to smile at the youngest children and reassure them. Many are starting daycare for the first time. These first weeks of daycare may be some children's first extended exposure to adults wearing masks. Ms. Rieu has been talking to the school's director about starting a kind of informal sign language with the toddlers as a way to increase communication. The mask has made it harder to express emotion, but also communicate with youngsters at the dawn of language learning. We've also thought about putting pictures up on the wall of people with different emotions, says Ms. Rieu, to show them that emotions don't stop at our nose. But while Ms. Rieu says she's worried about the long-term consequences of wearing masks on young children and their ability to detect nuances of emotion, some experts say there is so far no need for concern. It's still too early to say, but generally children have an incredible ability to adapt, says Ms. Vineau, the psychologist. For very young children and babies, they live in the immediate. So if something is wrong, they're going to alert adults right away to meet their needs. But some say those with learning disorders or other disabilities can still suffer from wearing masks in everyday life as well as in school settings. We need to move forward with making clear masks free and available on a Europe-wide scale, says Mathieu Anero, president of the APHPP, a national disability rights organization. Because right now, people with disabilities are being penalized twice, having a handicap as well as not being able to understand when someone is speaking. Students behind the masks too. Even for those without a disability, the ability to understand speech from behind an opaque mask is a challenge. Claire Marchandot has had to completely rethink her lessons at the Alliance Francaise, where she teaches beginner level French to adults. She's taken to over exaggerating her expressions and has drawn out pictures of the mouth and its varying positions for different sounds, especially vowels, which she said are particularly hard to articulate non visually. But the system only works one way. I can't verify the position of my students' mouths to know if their tongue or lips are in the right place, says Miss Marchandot, who wears a surgical mask to teach her group lessons. Luckily, you can usually hear if something isn't being pronounced correctly. I just make them repeat, repeat, repeat. The advantage, she says, is that students are forced to articulate every word. Shy students must speak up to be heard over their masks, and oral participation is more important than ever. With students of many backgrounds and nationalities, the common denominator is a desire to understand and be understood. It comes down to the different personalities of each student in how they interact in this new setting, says Ms. Marchandot, but there's no question on my end as the teacher. I can't take my mask off. And finally, an apology ricochets in the Koreas. Long portrayed as infallible, North Korea's leader apologizes for the killing of a South Korean. His move from myth-making to truth-telling opens a door for peace. By the Monitor's editorial board, hard conflicts sometimes need the soft touch of truth. That could now be the case for the two Koreas, which have been at odds for 70 years, either in all-out war or frequent violent encounters. On September 25th, in a rare admission of fallibility, the supreme leader of North Korea apologized to the South Korean people. Kim Jong-un wrote in a letter that he was sorry for his military shooting a South Korean official found floating in the sea a few days earlier. He also admitted the killing will clearly have a negative impact on inter-Korean relations. In the spirit of reconciliation, Mr. Kim promises such incidences would not occur. Was his apology sincere, or merely a self-serving charm offensive to split South Korea from its ally, the United States, which is deeply concerned about North Korea's nuclear arsenal? At the least, his apparent contrition lies in contrast to a similar incident in 2008, when a South Korean tourist was killed after straying into a Northern Korea military area. Mr. Kim's father, Kim Jong II, and ruler at the time, did not apologize. In addition to the apology, this third member of the Kim family to rule seems to be chafing under the aura of infallible leadership handed down in the propaganda machine set up by his grandfather, Kim Il-sung. As part of the dynasty's deification, all Northern Koreans must wear lapel pins with images of the late Kims. As with many leaders who rely on a personality cult, the humility to admit mistakes is often seen as a weakness and dangerous. Yet in August, Mr. Kim told his people that his 2016 economic plan had failed due in part to his government's shortcomings. In a country where it is a crime to criticize policy, Mr. Kim's honest self-reflection could open a door for others to do so. Last March, Mr. Kim told propaganda workers to move away from the mystification of him and focus more on his human side. If the people are mesmerized by a leader, he wrote, that might cover up the truth. These days, after Mr. Kim's apology, South Korean President Moon Jae-in followed suit. He apologized to his own people for his government's failure to protect the citizens killed by North Korea. He said Mr. Kim's apology opens an opportunity for dialogue. He proposed the two countries jointly investigate the incidents. Small gestures, like an apology, can often turn around a broken relationship. They hint that someone is willing to change. They help break down stereotypes of the other and point to a shared reality of truth and even affection. The Koreans have a long path to a permanent peace. Yet when leaders come off their false pedestals, it can set peace in motion. One correction. I said Kim Jong the second, and it is Kim Jong-il. Well, my friends, that completes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, October 2nd. This is Pam saying, you be greatly blessed today and do what you can to make today a great day.